Hi there, and welcome to Mission Critical Development's module on schedule management. Remember, in order to control your project, you must plan for the management of your scope, your schedule, your resources, your stakeholders, as well as your risks. Right now, we're going to focus on managing and planning your schedule. There are 5 steps in schedule planning. The first is activity definition. We've actually already done this using the work breakdown structure in the decomposed hierarchy. Remember, I wasn't worried about order of operations, just the level of detail in the WBS. Now I'm going to move to a tool called the network diagram, where I'm going to sequence those activities, estimate the resources, and then decide on the duration of those activities. Lastly, I'll develop a schedule using a Gantt chart. Right now, we'll focus on developing our activity sequence. Remember, when we developed our work breakdown structure, we continuously added detail to the work that's required to complete my project. Now I'm going to take those activities and put them in order. Using the network diagram, I will first decide on the initial activity that needs to be completed. In this case, I first need to define the dates before I move on. After I've defined the dates, I can now identify the venue, identify the sites, and create meeting materials. Once I've completed identifying the venue and the sites, only then can I send the invitation letter. After I identified the sites and created meeting materials, only then can I prepare sites for the visits. I will continue to add dependencies using these arrows to all of the activities on my work breakdown structure until I complete my project. Looking at my work breakdown structure, I want to focus at the lower levels of detail, because this is where I've probably added enough detail to show actionable tasks. The next step is simply putting that in order. Now that I have added dependencies on my network diagram to sequence my activities, the next step is to estimate the resources that I need to complete each of those tasks in step 3. When I think about the resources, I need to think about the skills that are required to complete the tasks. Also, I need to consider the availability of those resources. If I have a certain individual that can only complete a task, I need to consider if they're available to complete it during the time period I need. So when I look at my resources, I must identify an adequate number and mix of people, the constraints and skill levels. For instance, if somebody is not very skilled at a certain activity, they may take a little bit longer. And I also have to consider the duration and budget. If each of these activities are taking longer based on the skill set of my project team, is my project able to absorb that in the current duration that I've allotted? Step 3 in estimating resources is simply a conversation or a brainstorming session with my project team. I need to consider the resource constraints, the availability of my staff, and the requirements of each of the tasks. Only then can I move on to step 4, which is estimating my activity durations. I'm going to return to my network diagram and define the duration of each of my activities using working days. It's important to use working days and not units like weeks or months, because using weeks and months makes it very difficult for me to know when there are vacations and when there are holidays. Also, in some cultures, they may have a different set of working days per working week. So that's why it's important to estimate each of my activities in the number of days it will require to complete each task. So looking at defining the dates, the first task, considering my resources and the requirements of that task, I estimate that to be 5 working days. And I will continue to add working days to each of the activities on my network diagram until all of it is completed. Now that I've defined all of the working days, I can estimate the overall time I need to complete my project. So in order to hold a meeting, pause this video for a moment and tell me how many working days that is required to complete this project. If you said 27 days, you're correct. What you have just identified is a concept called the critical path, which is the longest sequence of dependent activities on my network diagram. I simply didn't add all the working days together because some of these tasks can be done in parallel. In this case, defining the dates, identifying the venue, sending the invitation letter, collecting travel info, sending the confirmation letter, and holding the meeting is the longest duration, which takes 27 days, in comparison to 15 days for the center path and also 20 days for the lower level path. The critical path is not only a useful tool to help me understand the duration of my project, but also to manage my anxiety. For instance, I might receive a phone call of the person who is supposed to be identifying the sites saying they'll be delayed by 3 days. Am I worried? Perhaps not, because identifying the sites is not on my critical path. However, I may receive another phone call saying that the person identifying the sites will be delayed 5 days. Am I worried now? In fact, I am, because now the new task of identifying sites is going to be on my critical path. The number of days that a non-critical path activity can be delayed is a concept called float, or sometimes referred to as slack. In this case, identifying the sites can be delayed up to 4 days without affecting my critical path. That's because, due to my dependencies, identifying the sites can be done while I'm still identifying the venue. Because it's a 6-day task, it can float within the 10-day period. Therefore, identifying the sites has a float of 4 days. Take a moment now and identify the float of a non-critical path activity on your project. By definition, your critical path has 0 float. Unfortunately, there will be delays to activities on your critical path. In those cases, you have 2 options. The first scenario is crashing. Crashing refers to adding additional resources to my project in order to reduce the amount of time that's going to take for each activity. So for instance, if I have a delay on my critical path, I can decide to crash identifying the venue. Instead of taking a Jeep to identify the venue, instead I'll book a plane ticket. That will reduce the activity duration of identifying the venue from 10 days down to 5. I obviously am spending more money, therefore I'm adding more resources. Crashing also refers to adding resources such as time, like working extra hours, and also money to hire an expertise or more people to help me complete my tasks. In this case, I'm able to reduce the overall critical path to 22 days. However, in some cases, I will not have any resources to add to my project. In those scenarios, I can use an option called fast tracking. Fast tracking is when I take something off of the critical path and instead do it in parallel. In this case, I've decided to send the invitation letters before I've completed identifying the venue. This is not ideal, however, because it introduces new risks. Because I'm sending invitation letters before I've identified the venue, it could affect the overall response rate because people may not want to join if they don't know what the venue is. In this case, I've been able to reduce my critical path to 26 days. In review, to handle delays to my critical path activities, I have 2 options. The first is crashing, which means I'll add additional resources to my project in the form of extra people, extra money, or even working overtime. The second technique is fast tracking, which means I'm taking something off of the critical path, and instead of doing it in sequence, I do it in parallel. Again, this is not ideal because it may introduce new risks. Now that I've identified the duration of my activities, I can now add all of my activities to a calendar using a Gantt chart. In step 5, activity schedule. In step 5, developing my activity schedule. You may be very familiar with a Gantt chart, which is a graphical representation of my activities using start and end dates. It is the only tool in my schedule management that does have start and end dates. In this case, I've listed all of my activities and then designated when they will occur on a monthly calendar. Mission Critical Development suggests enhancing your Gantt chart by adding members of your team who are responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. This defines the ratio we'll discuss later. However, by adding these elements to your Gantt chart, not only am I able to see the activities, but I also see who is responsible for doing that, who should be informed and consulted for it, who's overall accountable for it, as well as the graphical representation of when it's supposed to occur on a calendar. Thanks so much for watching Schedule Development.